Hello and welcome to Tarim Talks. I'm your host, Babur. Today we're talking with Dr. Rian Thum. Thank you very much for coming on the show. And please, if you could introduce yourself in one sentence.
Yes, my name is Rian Thum, and I'm a historian and anthropologist at the University of Manchester, where I specialize in the history of Muslims in China and Uyghur history.
And what does that entail? What does your job entail? And what are some projects that you're currently working on?
So my job is, I was hired as the historian of China. I took this job after publishing my first book on Uyghur history, and I am currently finishing up really a book about the history mostly of Chinese-speaking Muslims, the history of people who considered themselves Chinese in some way and simultaneously considered themselves to be Muslims. That does include some cases of Uyghurs, and Uyghurs are integral to that story because many of the forms of Islam that took off among the peoples that we now call Hui were actually brought to Hui communities via Uyghur communities.
And so you said that you took this position after your first book. What was that about?
So the question of my first book was, how do Uyghurs in the Uyghur region today, the today of the time I was doing the research, which was the first decade of the 2000s, how do they understand history? And how has that changed over time? Where do the habits and norms and values of learning about the Uyghur past, where do they come from? How were they shaped over time? And a lot of the answer to that question was that Uyghurs, as of, say, 100 or 150 years ago, got much of their education about their own past at holy places, shrines, tombs of Muslim heroes and saints. And that information that was given at the shrines was also embedded in the circulation of manuscript books about these various heroes who were buried locally. So a lot of the book is about how that worked 150 years ago, 200, even 300 years ago, where that system of pilgrimage to the shrines and stories of these saints comes from, how it developed. And then the book traces how these traditions of understanding the past have changed over time. You know, in the last 50 years, it's often become very difficult to do pilgrimage. Even as of 2007, 2008, when I did the bulk of my anthropological fieldwork, most urban Uyghurs were not doing these kinds of pilgrimages, and people weren't reading manuscripts anymore. They didn't have access to them. So the book traces how these earlier patterns of producing history change in the more recent time and jump into the world of historical fiction, which is this world of printed novels about famous figures, and what happens when you separate that tradition from the shrines and from the manuscripts.
Yeah, can you go a little more into that? What are some of the more famous stories that have been passed down through the tazkiras, right? Mm-hmm. And also, when you're speaking about historical fiction, what do you mean when you're separating what has happened versus what has been written, which you're saying is not necessarily the same thing?
Right. Well, this is the case with any historical source. All historical writing is one or more humans' attempts to capture what has happened, but also inject their own worldview. So, no historical source can be taken as some pure reflection of the past. at the same time, every historical source is a product of its own time, and so we can learn something about that time from them. The interesting thing with the historical fiction is that, in an environment where Uyghurs were not allowed by the Chinese state to freely produce their own historical writing, and where historical writing was seen as like highly political, as it is today, even more so. A lot of authors found that the best way to talk about their past was through books that were labeled as fiction. And Uyghur readers were more likely in the early 2000s to turn to fiction, things that were labeled as novels, and which were indeed fictionalized. They have conversations in them between the main characters that we have no historical documentation for example. Both audiences turn to that and authors turn to that as a safer way to talk about the past and as a way to get things into print and to access books. And the thing that intrigued me so much and got me really started on my research question was I found that there was a really unusual proportion of the things that people were reading to understand their own history were biographical novels. This is a genre that doesn't have a big footprint in English, and I would say most English-speaking readers have probably never read a biographical novel. It's very similar to a genre of film, however, that is very popular in English. That's the biopic. I'm struggling to come up with a recent example, but like there's a film about Ray Charles, right? Well, we know Ray Charles existed. Most of what's in it is roughly true, but there's a lot of invented material.
Yeah, like Oppenheimer, which came out.
Oppenheimer, perfect example. So the novel, the printed novel version of that is well, it's hard to say now after the last 8 years, but was before that perhaps the most popular form of writing about the past among Uyghurs in the Uyghur region. And people really regarded, even though it said novel, roman, people regarded this as the most authoritative source for knowledge. And I was curious about how that came about. And the hypothesis that I argue for in the book is that, yes, it was partly a question of censorship and what you could get into print, and fiction is a kind of a safe cover for talking about history, but that also the interest in these was a carryover from this earlier genre that existed when manuscripts dominated book production, and that's the Tazkira that you mentioned, which was a book that was seen as religious, as sacred, but which talked about the local past of people who died in the Uyghur region. Most of those stories do not actually cross into the novels. There's a moment in the early 1980s when writing of these novels becomes possible, and there's a selection, a change in who's going to be heroes for the Uyghur people.
I see.
In the old Tezkira world of manuscripts, it was all people who had died in the Uyghur region. That was how you connected someone to the place, was that their tomb was there. Okay. But in the 80s, you're looking at a world where nationalism has taken hold of people's imaginations, and in nationalist viewpoints, the most important connection that a person has to a place is being born there. So there's this change, and people kind of look for the heroes that were born in the Uyghur region rather than just died there. And so the stories that end up crossing over from the earlier genre to the new novel genre are the stories of saints who also were born in the region, who are a minority of the major saints in the Uyghur region. Most of the major saints are said to have been born somewhere else and come to the region. Right. So you asked for a specific example. A good example is Satuk Bohra Khan, whose Thum is in Atush, near Kashgar, and who is often called the first Muslim Turk, or the first Muslim Uyghur. He converted to Islam and became this Islamic ruler of the Uyghur region. He has a pretty short tazkira. I don't know, maybe it's 40 pages in an English translation. That was turned into a Uyghur novel. That story, that base material is turned into a Uyghur novel that's, I think, something like 900 pages or something like that, which became in the late 80s one of the most popular historical works among Uyghurs.
Why do you think? Well, I guess you answered this partially, but um, the shift, which was this being drawn towards this because of getting around censors, but also this connection to the old manuscripts. Um, why do you think that those old manuscripts were works of historical fiction in the first place, as opposed to what we would say now, more grounded, sort of academic style journals or books, monographs? And then the second question I have, which maybe I should ask later, is: do you think that Uyghur culture and identity shifted as nationalism rose as an ideology, and Uyghurs cared maybe less about where you had died and more about where you were born? We can see the reflection in the content or the literature that is being consumed, but I'm interested to see the ripple effects of that throughout Uyghur society at the time.
Yeah, so I wouldn't call the tazkiras historical fiction, but thinking about that term is a great way to see how things have changed. There is in the world of the manuscripts, and the manuscripts are completely dominant as the production for books into the 1920s and 1930s. There are lithographs, which is another printing technology, in circulation, and some being imported, but they don't seem to have had the same kind of circulation, and they don't produce local texts by local authors. So in this world of manuscripts sprinkled with some lithographs, there isn't a category of fiction in the same way we have this clear divide today between fiction and nonfiction. The tazkiras were regarded as accurate. They were regarded as representations of the truth about the past, and also the truth of the sort of the structure of the universe, the nature of reality, the role of God, to the extent that it can affect your everyday life.
So not just local history, but more so containing the sum of all knowledge about what is known in this world.
Kind of a reflection of the nature of things.
Sure. Okay.
They tend to be pretty narrow stories about an individual or a group of individuals going around doing miraculous things and fighting battles.
Right.
But embedded in them is a clear sense of what the nature of existence is and what good and bad are. And these were also regarded as sacred texts. Some of them have inscriptions on them by later readers or in the text that say that to doubt this text is to become an unbeliever, and that your face will be black on Judgment Day, and bad things will happen to you if you don't believe this text. So they were regarded very much as truth, whereas these novels today have this word roman on them, and they often have which has a fictional implication, and the authors are often clear in their introductions that they are creating something themselves,
Okay.
while also trying to be true to the past. So the stated position of these texts is very different. Now, of course, the Tezkiras also have miraculous deeds in them that very few people today would believe actually happened. Did Apak Hoja actually get revenge on the king of Bukhara or Samarkand by causing a log to fly hundreds of miles through the air and smash the king's face? Probably not. So we have to read them in light of what people at the time thought was possible. But despite this miraculous material, which has caused a lot of scholars to disregard them as historical texts, they often preserve some very accurate empirical factual material, sometimes quite old. So you can see when they name, very occasionally they will name a historically known figure, or more than one, and sometimes you can see that those figures actually line up. They did actually live within the same decade or two, which is a pretty remarkable amount of preservation of data in the case I'm thinking of, which is the Karakhanid Holy Wars. This is a transmission of data over the course of 1,000 years that stays pretty uncorrupted. So to your second question, which is about how Uyghur culture and identity shifted as nationalism takes hold, it's an enormous shift, and it takes a long time. Really, the early projects to try to get the people we now know as Uyghurs to imagine themselves as a nation, they come about in the early 20th century. And they get a big boost in the 1930s with the first Republic of East Turkestan. But there are a lot of complaints at the time that Uyghurs aren't even calling themselves Uyghurs. And it's not really clear when this now pretty much universal habit of saying I am a Uyghur, when that becomes universal. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, we need more research, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the 70s there were still communities who didn't really feel attached to that name of Uyghur. So that just gives you a sense of how recent that transition to nationalism is. Just to pick out one characteristic that's changed with the arrival of nationalism is that in a nationalist worldview, people tend to understand the community as the source of political legitimacy. And so who should govern Uyghurs? Well, the right to rule the Uyghurs should come from the Uyghurs themselves as an ethno-national group. And it comes with a sense that everywhere that there are Uyghurs over a certain determinate amount of space, that right prevails with the Uyghurs, and that Uyghurs have some degree of homogeneity. There are some things that are very clearly shared evenly across that space. And so we see at this time the desire to create a territorial name, the adoption of Eastern Turkestan, which is a modification of a much older word, Turkestan, to express this homogeneity. But in the days of the manuscripts and the Tazkiras, people didn't imagine their home or their sense of us in such a spatialized and homogeneous way. It was more of a collection of dots, a collection of points on the landscape, cities, tombs, and people who are similar enough to us to be included in the stories we tell about the past, rather than this sort of carpeting of this whole region should have this, same shared culture. There was a sense that, well, there's something about those Khotanliks and those Kuchaliks that's shared, that makes us consider them an us. But if we're going to read a history of our own past and we're Kashgariks, like we're probably going to mostly read stories of saints around Kashgar and maybe a few from Khotan and a few from Kucha, but we don't really read books about the sort of wider territory and try to create an even balance, which becomes more of an impulse under the influence of nationalism.
Yeah, I think this is something that you had written and noted that I think it was Mahmoud Kashgari who was saying something to the line of, will the plight of the Musliman end, or something similar to that, and referencing Musliman as the people who lived in like the Altasher region, the Turkic Muslims who lived there, because he was referencing invaders, Kyrgyz tribes who were also Turkic Muslims, but were not considered, Musliman. Like there was another, is it ethnonym, the word for describing yourself,
Yeah,
or like a group of people,
yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. That Uyghur was not used in that term, or even Turk. It was like Musliman very specifically, and yet it still excluded other people who, at face value at least, shared some of those traits.
Yeah. There's different societies around the world have had historically different levels of interest in creating a distinct name for themselves, and a lot of the ethnonyms that are in use in the world today come from the word for human in the language that right. that they're drawn from, and the people that we now call Uyghurs, or their ancestors, didn't have quite the same dedication to having a unique, distinguishable ethnonym. At the same time, there was a sense that there's a group bigger than just the people of Kashgar.
Yeah.
That we share something with the people from Turpan and the people from Khotan. And so people did resort to a word for us. And that wasn't always the same, but the most common one seems to have been Musulman, which is very confusing because it is the way to say Muslim.
Yeah, exactly.
So you might be inclined to read that as just like them talking about Muslims, which would include a much wider part of the population of the planet. But we often see in the manuscript text people using the word Musulman only to refer to those who spoke this late version of Chagatai, which is the early version of modern Uyghur, and who were settled rather than nomads, or farmers rather than herders, and were in this network of pilgrimage routes that covers the Uyghur region today. And so that results in interesting things like the text you're talking about, which is the Tezkira Azizen from the 18th century, in which the author refers to battles between the Muslimans and the Kyrgyz.
Yeah.
Specifically talking about Kyrgyz, who we know to have been Muslims and who the author knew to be Muslims, but they don't count as Musliman. Or during the rebellions of the late 19th century, when you have the Dungans, as they were called in the manuscripts, the Chinese-speaking Muslims, who are distinguished from the Musulmans.
Right.
And you even sometimes see the language of the Uyghurs' 19th century ancestors called Musulmanche, which is a different language from, say, the language of the Quran, Arabic. Musulmanche is this Turkic language. But I should also emphasize, though, different other terms are used sometimes. You do see the word Turk coming up sometimes. And there are various place names, like Tatarstan appears in one Tezkira. Mogulistan is a slightly older one. Altashahr is common. Very rarely Altashahrlik. That's a bit late, early 20th century. But yeah, it's an interesting that lack of homogeneous conformity to a single ethnonym, I think, is a expression of a non-nationalist worldview.
Yeah, that's really interesting. This sort of reminds me something you said earlier about how modern Uyghurs, at least those who are living in urban areas, aren't doing the pilgrimages, and of course we know now that many of these sites have been destroyed, and there are probably harsh penalties or restrictions on Uyghurs who to conduct these pilgrimages at all, if they even if they could. So I'm curious, before this complete crackdown and ban on pilgrimages to the shrines, the mazars, um, when did the pilgrimages start to decline? The number of Uyghurs who participated in this?
Uh, there are some big challenges in historical documentation to giving an authoritative answer on that,
Sure.
but you start to see in the 1950s, the late 1950s, the Communist Party, after a short period where they're trying not to alienate Muslims in the Uyghur region, start to crack down and break up some of the shrine, what do you call them? Waqf, al-Qaf, foundations, the what is it's the it's the man, I'm trying to think of you'll have to edit some of this out.
No worries.
Why can't I think of the English word for this? Trust.
Okay.
So in the 1950s, the Chinese government begins to break up these trusts of the shrines, begins to remove some of their shrine employees' positions, cut down on the number of people working there. And then in the Cultural Revolution, it looks as though it becomes almost impossible to make these pilgrimages. And for 10 years or more, pilgrimages cease. And then in the 1980s, when this reform and opening up period begins across China, a lot of the restrictions are lifted, and people begin to build back the shrine culture. So all through the 80s and 90s, shrine culture seemed to be growing, and even into the 2000s, there was a growth. One of the shrines that I worked at repeatedly was a small shrine outside of Hotan, which I saw during my years of going there expand how many people were showing up on the periodic pilgrimages, and they expanded their buildings as well. So I think a lot of shrines were, even up until say 2009, were still growing in their audiences and in their physical footprint. It's very hard to know, though, what percentage of people, as of the 2000s, when I was doing most of my field work, what percentage of people were actually engaging in shrine visitation. Partly because it's very complex. There are so many different kinds of shrine visitation. So there are these very large, famous shrines which will draw people from different oases, and sometimes even from the Chinese interior. Hui people will come to some of the Uyghur shrines. And then there are very local ones, which don't appear in any catalog of shrines, which people in the countryside know about. It's nearby. And if you want to do some prayers to have a male child or something like that, you do that at that local shrine. And you might not even know the history of the person who's buried there. It's just that everybody kind of agrees that somebody important is buried there and that the shrine has some kind of sacred powers. In the rural landscape, this was really common. And it's important to remember that before 2017, 80 or 90%, I think it's over 90% of Uyghurs in the Uyghur region were living in rural areas. The urban experience, which actually tends to get written about more, was very much a small minority part of Uyghur society. And the shrines really kept a lot of influence in the rural areas, whereas in the urban areas, it was kind of transferred into a textual presence through the novels.
I see. Yeah. I'm actually curious about the Hui Muslim people coming to do these pilgrimages as well. Is are any of these shrines connected to Hui Muslim people, or did it just sort of over time, I guess, become a part of traditions that Hui Muslims kept as well?
This is the question that actually led to my second book
Okay,
project.
yeah. Do
Um,
we save it for the book?
no,
Oh,
that's fine. I think it's really fascinating. The I when I was doing my research on shrine pilgrimage, and I was directly interested in Uyghur historical practices. I noticed a couple of times that there were Hui people at these shrines, and I was very focused, and I didn't, ask them any questions or interact with them. But once my book came out in 2014, I started thinking a little bit more about what were those Hui people doing there? But what did they think they were doing, and what did they think these shrines were? So in 2015, I went back to the region specifically with the goal of answering that question. And that led me to learning about a lot about networks that connect Hui pilgrims with Uyghur culture. There are several different reasons for this, but probably the most sort of discrete, neat story is in one of the Sufi movements, the Naqshbandiya Mujaddidiya movement, which was born in Mughal India and moved through Afghanistan and expanded into most notably Yarkand, but also the Aksu region, where sort of a Sufi center was set up. Now, Sufism was dominant anyway in the region, but this is just a particular branch of authority, a chain of transmission of our way of doing Sufism that originates in Sirhind, India. And they established a pretty strong base among Uyghurs, and there were Uyghur sheikhs, Uyghur leaders of the movement in Yarkand, which drew Hui pilgrims from Gansu, also Dongxiang and Salar pilgrims came.
Just for reference, how far away are they from Yarkand?
At least 1,000 kilometers, I would say. A bit very far. I mean, these are people living in the eastern part of Gansu and Qinghai, sort of the Qinghai-Gansu border region, either up on the edge of the Tibetan plateau or down just where it falls down into the Gansu corridor. So this is very far for them, but the Hui already by that time in that region had a tradition of valuing religious expertise gained through travel. An idea that there's more authentic learning to be had if you go west. So this movement, this Mujaddidiya movement, really takes hold and starts to spread in the very beginning of the 1800s. But by that point, there was already a Hui group in Gansu that ascribed their origins to Apak Hoja, whose father and then himself are said to have preached in Gansu and Qinghai. And the Jahariya also had sent, they were formed by a religious expert who went to Yemen. So there's this idea that if you go far away, the knowledge you get, or if you learn from somebody who came from far away, the knowledge you get is special.
And when they said going west, were they referring to like the Altasher or the region of the Uyghur homeland, or was it more so that was a stop along the way towards the Middle East, West Asia?
It looks like it could be either. I guess it would depend on the time and the individuals involved, whether they saw going to the Arab world as superior to going to, Central Asia. But there are movements that root their authority in both of those kinds of movement. So that probably explains why some people showed up in Yarkand seeking teachings there, and they brought it back. There are saints of this tradition buried in Ningxia, in Gansu, in Qinghai, and this Mujahideen approach had a wide influence across Hui Muslims everywhere. But because of that, those who still really care for the chain of transmission through various masters, I don't know if they can do it now under current restrictions, but as of 2015 and 2017, when I was last there, they were still making the pilgrimage to Altashahr to go to the tomb in Yarkand of where the various leaders of the Yarkand Mujahideen movement was. They also, however, there also are Hui people who go to tombs that are not affiliated with a particular Sufi lineage. So Hui people, I saw them at the tomb of Imam Jafari Sadiq in outside of Nia, and they're documented as going to Turpan to Ashab al-Kaf, but I never saw Hui people at Ashab al-Kaf when I was there.
Yeah. So maybe this is a good time now to talk more about your experiences there. But I want to start from how did you first become interested in history and in, I suppose, academia as a whole?
Well, I've always just had a deep fascination for old things. I guess it started off with a fascination for objects from another time because they if you look at a penny dated 1892, you have this assurance that it is a representation of some past that is gone, and you can touch it, and you're touching this thing. If I felt some connection and some sense of transportation to some alternate way of existing in the world, I guess the old things just absolutely fascinated me as a child, and I that led to an interest in archaeology, which is what I studied at university. And to do archaeology as a profession, there are really two tracks. One is you work for the government, and anytime a highway is built, you are sent out to make sure that there's nothing there. So it's the kind of archaeology of looking to find nothing. And then when you do find it, you excavate and you do the things that you think of archaeologists doing. The other one is the academic archaeologist. Though that's really the route that you would want to go if you want your job to be framing your own questions about the past and choosing where you want to dig. So to me, it seemed clear that the only path to doing what I was interested in was academia. And I did a few archaeological digs when I was in university, in mostly in Syria, and after university, I also did the government archaeology for a summer in a national forest, which was a wonderful job, actually, hiking around a national forest in Utah every day. But after my experiences working on digs in Syria, I realized I had an equal interest, not just in the 2,000 or 3 or 4,000 year old dead bodies I was digging up, but also in the people living there at the time who I was interacting with. And as I thought about going to graduate school, I wanted to do something that engaged both the past, the dead people, and the present, that allowed me to think about how the past is shaping people's lives today, and what role it plays for them. So for that reason, I moved away from archaeology to history, because it allowed me to get more involved in texts and the continuities between the past and the present.
Started out in Syria, and how did you, I guess, eventually make your way into Central Asia and then the Uyghur homeland?
So I showed up for the first time in the Uyghur region in 1999 on my way to do study abroad in China. I was very interested in learning languages, and I wanted to try my hand at Chinese. And I entered from Kazakhstan and spent a few nights in Urumqi, and that was my first in-person, experience of Uyghur community. And Urumqi at that time had a much stronger stamp of Uyghur culture on it, not just in this museumified way that you see at Da Bazar, but actual living, Uyghur markets run mostly by Uyghur people. And it was really fascinating to me because it brought together several of my interests. The archaeology I was interested in was actually a Central Asian kingdom that had come down into Syria and conquered. Okay. So I was already interested in Central Asia and its particular dynamics of nomadic herding peoples and settled peoples. So in the Uyghur region, my interest in Central Asia sparked my interest in Islamic societies and the different ways Islam expresses itself in different contexts, was engaged, and my budding interest in China, which is a major player in Uyghur history, was also engaged. So it really was a place and a people and a culture that engaged a lot of interests I already had.
Yeah. So you had spent a few nights in Urumqi and presumably moved to your destination at the time.
Yeah.
And when was the next time you would come back? And what drew you to come back?
So I had been reading about the Uyghur region before I went, and actually had learned more Uyghur phrases and vocabulary than I did Chinese before I showed up. So I went and I did my my study abroad in Tianjin in China, learning Chinese, and then when that was over, I don't remember the exact sequence, but at some point when that was over, I went back out to the Uyghur region and spent a little more time there, and then crossed to Pakistan. And then when I was in graduate school, I came back and did a longer stint. A whole summer I spent in Kashgar, and that was when I really developed a deeper commitment and interest in the region. I was really struck by how much the people in Kashgar were committed to keeping alive the parts of their culture that were important to them, even in the face of pressures, economic and political, that would seem to make it in their interest not to. So that's hopelessly abstract. Let me give an example. My favorite example of this is hinges for doors.
Yeah.
So, Kashgar 2002 or 2003, whenever it was, it's in the borders of this massively industrialized country, the People's Republic of China, that is doing manufacturing for much of the world and is specialized in producing simple industrial manufacturers at very low prices. So you would expect Uyghur markets to just be flooded with goods made in the Chinese interior. But in fact, there was a real commitment to making things by hand in older ways. So the what do you call them? Blacksmiths shops continued, and people hammered out hinges by hand. Pretty much all furniture for infants continued to be turned by hand on lathes by the what do you call the I don't think they're carpenters, but woodworkers who make all the equipment for baby cribs. And this was because there's a certain way that a hinge should look. There's a certain way that a baby's crib should look. Yeah, exactly. Some of it was functional. Some of it I think was aesthetic. And I was really stunned by how to the great lengths that people went to have things done the way that fit their norms, rather than buying the cheaper hinge that you could get at the Chinese market down the street. And it was different. On my way to the region, my first trip to the region, I had passed through former Soviet Central Asia, which shares a lot of cultural material with Uyghurs, and I didn't see that in Uzbekistan. I didn't see that same kind of persistence. And I was also looking at the time at there was an earlier round of the destruction of the city of Kashgar that was happening at that period. And I was looking around at these buildings in the old city being razed, but also noticing what people were doing in the suburbs and exurbs, which was building houses in the same style as the old city style of houses, almost relocating the old city to the margins of where the state was interested. And I think that would probably be the biggest standout thing that really drew me in and raised questions for me. And in a way, what I saw in the traditions of historical practice is kind of a reflection of that. The tezkira can't really exist anymore because of government rules and because of the death of the manuscript. But people were kind of finding a way to still exercise some of the impulses of the tezkira genre through the idea of the novel, which was a pretty recent arrival in the region.
I'm interested in your opinion then about why you think places like Kashgar, they tried their best to stick to, I suppose, traditional or local norms, like you said, with the hinge crafting or the crib making, whereas other Turkic countries did not, or maybe they weren't even able to maintain those norms.
Wow, I have no idea. I mean, some of that may be about different levels of investment by the colonial states in trying to destroy and transform the culture. Some of it might not be with the people being transformed, and then some of it is going to be with the people who are the targets of this assimilation. What is it about their way of doing things or understanding the world that encourages them to invest so much in preservation? And I don't know what that is. That would require, I think, a different kind of research that's deeply embedded in those other cultures where it's not happening. And I haven't done that, so I don't know. It's a bit of a mystery to me.
Fair enough. Yeah, so you spent some time in Kashgar and you found these things about Uyghur culture, society that had drawn you in. I'm curious when you were there, or all the times that you were there during your time in studying Uyghurs, what did you find about Uyghur culture and society that was different from everything else you had previously studied?
Um, well, I mean, with as with any part of the world, any community, in the 2000s, uh, it's more of a question of the combination of elements that makes a culture distinct. I mean,
Yeah,
most parts of my own culture as a Midwestern American, pretty much anything that's part of my culture is shared with some other culture
sure.
somewhere. Um, and I think you can say the same for most aspects of Uyghur culture. There's something similar connected to some neighboring cultures, but in their particular constellation, uh, they are unique, and that's really where it's the interaction of these different elements that create the sort of unusual expressions of culture. Like, the one I focus on for my research is how do you understand the past, which I would argue in its totality, in the sum of its parts, is very, very different. This way that Uyghurs were understanding the past as of, say, 1900
Mhm.
is very different than other parts of the world. They're in its sum. Like a lot of it, like I said, a lot of individual aspects you can find elsewhere, but we're talking about an interaction with the past where to learn your local history, you go to the presence of the historical actors. When you're at the shrine,
Yeah.
you know or believe that the deceased person is there, their spirit is there, and you can ask them for things and talk to them. That is the place where you're learning about the past. So it'd be kind of like if I had learned all of my American history exclusively at the monuments and memorials where it supposedly happened. So this is a very different way of doing history. It's one where the individual can not only is engaged by being there, but can leave their mark on things. People they touch the shrines. They in some places they eat little pieces of dirt from cracks between the bricks. There are wells where you should drink the water. So you have this real physical interaction with these nodes of the past.
Yeah.
And then if you're literate and which a surprising number of people were for the time, there was a lot of literacy in the spoken language, which wasn't the case for a lot of populations on the other side of the mountains in Central Asia. If you're copying a story, you make changes to it. Or if you're reading it, you may make a little note in the margins that says you've been there or tells who you got the book from. So people are kind of inserting themselves in the history in a way that is, I think, kind of special. And for me as a historian, seeing a different way of doing history is particularly exciting. And also, I think, an important reminder that the way we do history as academics, as professionalized historians, where our job is just to write and teach about history, that our own culture of doing history is also a culturally specific practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you said cultures are these constellations of traits or pieces that make them unique. What did you find unique about the Uyghurs of the modern era that you were among? You had spoken about you not only enjoy old things and
Mm-hmm.
history, but also the people that exist around you as the in the context of the history that came before them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, what made Uyghurs unique in your time while you were there with them, observing them, studying?
Yeah. So to just stick with the approaches to history angle, which is the thing that interested me the most and that I ended up spending a lot of time working on. I was, when I went to, so I studied Uyghur in Urumqi at Xinjiang University in 2004 and 5. And that's when I started to have a better sense of, what people were saying and what they were interested in. And I was absolutely stunned by the level of popular interest in history. I don't think I've seen it anywhere else. I mean, all cultures show an interest in their own past. It's often a intense interest, but I have never been among any group of people who have been so intensely and almost universally interested in history as what I experienced among Uyghurs in the early 2000s. It was particularly among, I was a young man, and so most of my interactions were with young men. And in that demographic, I mean, it was just this is a favorite hobby of people. That this is something young men like to sit around and talk about history. It was absolutely unavoidable. Constant questions about, have you read this? Have you read that?
Yeah.
Constant debates over, whether this historical figure was actually as great as people say he was, or whether he's as good as this other historical figure that's my favorite. Where can we get accurate historical information? And, I had less access to and different access to Uyghur women, older generations, but there's a similar pattern among them. The loaning of books was really fascinating to me. Because although at an international level, books were extremely cheap compared to a lot of other countries, for most Uyghur people in the early 2000s, books were very expensive. And boy, did those books get around. Like, I encountered this because people would tell me something about the history of such and such, and I would say, "Oh, where did you find that out?" Oh, and then they'd give me a title of a book, and I'm like, "Oh, do you have that? Can I look?" And they say, "Oh, no, I passed it on to the next person." Okay. And so most people didn't seem to have, that I was talking to, didn't seem to have more than 2 or 3 or 4 books around, but they had read extremely widely. This is in a context with no libraries, really, no accessible libraries of Uyghur literature. So that was the real standout thing for me. I had never seen anything like that, and I haven't seen anything that kind of extreme interest in history. I haven't seen it anywhere else.
Yeah, just speaking anecdotally as a young Uyghur man who has friends who are young Uyghur men, I feel like not much has changed. That definitely is still a favorite topic of conversation.
Yeah.
Among young Uyghurs.
Yeah.
Just generally. So that is interesting to see that there's this persistence in this interest. And why do you think that is?
Well, part of it is probably a result of the position of Uyghur society as a victim of colonial domination, the limits on Uyghurs posed from outside on their own political self-determination. So that it is something we do see certain kinds of interest in the past that flourish among colonized peoples. So that in some ways it's not surprising. But I think there's something more to it than that. I can only speculate, really, because it's hard to think of a way that you would actually prove what the causes of this are. But I think I would speculate that one influence on this is the fact that historical practice, that engagements with history, were so integrated into people's lives as of 100 years ago or 150 years ago, that before this transition to the world of printing and nationalism, history was local history. The history of us Uyghurs, was not something that was taught in schools. There, elementary education was very widespread by the late 19th century. These are private, charitable schools, very widespread. But you do not learn in those schools about your own local history. It's not presented as something that is a detached object of academic interest. Instead, as I was saying, you learn it. If you're a tradesman, you learn it partly through the handbooks of your trade. If you go on a pilgrimage, you learn it at the shrines. If you go to the market, you hear stories read out. So I think it was so embedded in people's lives, and learning when the saints are present made it so real and so much not something that's a separate sphere of knowledge. I think that must have some influence on this interest today, that surely would give impetus and encouragement to people to take an interest in the past.
Yeah. I want to bring it back to the original topic of sort of your course of studies and the path you took to become an academic, and the timeline. So I'm curious, from when you entered as an archaeology undergrad, and then
Mm-hmm.
entered graduate school, and then had finished your PhD
Mm-hmm.
and wrote your first book and now are a professor. What were sort of the obstacles or challenges that you had faced along the way? And I guess the decision points or pivot points that you recall as important to you for where you ended up.
Mm-hmm. Um, well, that's a tough one. I mean, one of the major pivot points for me was doing archaeology in Syria. I worked in the northeastern part of Syria, uh, about, I would say, an hour and a half drive outside of the town of Hasaka, which is near the border of Iraq and Turkey. Um, it's not it's not a super economically developed region. It's a lot of recently settled nomadic um, uh, people, and I think just encountering people who became my friends living in such a different way from my own, and living under so much more difficult circumstances than my own, for me personally, made it very difficult to dedicate my life to studying, you know, where was the border of the Parthian Empire in 200 AD. You know, that it just, I felt a need to do something that would have an immediate, maybe not immediate, but a more direct engagement with people in the present. So yeah, I think that would be probably the biggest moment of change in my trajectory. Now, it didn't lead me to say I'm going to leave my plans for academia. Although I did consider that when I applied to do my PhD. I wasn't entirely sure that I wanted to stay in academia, and I was sort of 50-50 on that prospect, thinking that maybe I would go into some sort of public policy or something else that would have a more direct engagement with living people. But in the end, I got so invested in the material I was studying and the people I was working with, that I wanted to be able to continue to do that. And to be able to, one of the great things about academia is that you're really self-directed. If a academic wants to, after writing a book, wants to write a book on a totally different part of the world, they can. You're supposed to produce research at a certain pace depending on the institution you're at, but the topic of it is entirely up to you. Your daily schedule when you're not teaching is up to you. And that kind of independence to pursue the questions I was interested in was a real attraction, which allows me to tailor my research toward questions that I think are important for people living today, and that can only be answered through interaction with people living today. And so ultimately, I decided to stick with the academic path and seek academic jobs when I was at the sort of end of my PhD studies.
Yeah, and a lot of the people who listen to Tarim talks are young Uyghurs who are figuring out what they want to do, or have already figured out what they want to do, and are finding their path to continue doing that. And I know a lot of people are very interested in history, particularly the history of our own people. And so, for someone on the fence like you were once, what would you say to them about pursuing academia or pursuing history or Uyghur studies as a career?
So I think that let's see how to approach that. I guess the first thing I would say is that it's very hard to predict the way your decisions will pan out, and it's, I think, probably a mistake to be too committed to professional training, to view your education as training for one particular job. So you can go into history. Maybe you go into studying history with the idea of becoming an academic, but there are other paths. People end up working at museums. People end up working in totally different lines of work. A lot of medical schools actually have a preference for or an interest in students who have a humanities background before they go to medical school. So I do think there are a lot of points at which you can peel off and decide that you want to go a different direction. And it's very hard to predict, what you're going to be interested in 4 years from now or 10 years from now. I think that the humanities and social sciences are, when you're looking to what you want to do in university, humanities and social sciences are good for preparing you for change, preparing you for ways of thinking and ways of approaching problems that make you nimble and that make it possible to shift careers. All that said, if you're really passionate about history and you think that what you want to do is academic history, it is a somewhat challenging route. There are more people with PhDs than there are jobs for historians. And it takes a lot of training. A PhD is in North America is usually at least 5 years. A lot of people take longer. So it's a large investment of your time. I do think it's important for people to know that most strong PhD programs in history provide funding. So it's not like undergraduate where you build up a huge amount of debt. There are exceptions to that. but any program that is going to make you competitive for an academic job is also going to pay your way. So it's kind of like a poorly paying job rather than something you're paying for. One thing I think it's really important for people who want to pursue history is to read the primary sources. This sounds super basic and obvious, but reading widely in the texts that were written by the historical actors you're interested in sometimes gets underemphasized. In university education on history, there's a lot of like showing people one primary source each class period and being like, let's analyze this. But there's not as much encouragement to say, if you're interested in, Uyghur history of the 19th century, to just reading as many books written by Uyghurs in the 19th century as possible. And those are becoming more available. We have a lot of good translations now. Eric Schlussel's Tarikh-i-Hamidi is out. Jeff Eden did several Tezkira translations into English. And then there are a lot of translations into modern Uyghur, which were published in the Uyghur region in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s that are available online in PDFs. If you go to the Uyghur Collective website, UyghurCollective.com, something like that, they have a list of sites where you can get PDFs of Uyghur books. I just think it's really important when you're reading secondary literature, like my book or someone else's book, to also be reading what was actually written by the people you're studying, so that you can, see where your sense of that textual world of the past doesn't fit with what historians like me are writing today, and get your own opinions about what happened, why it happened, how people were living. So I think it's something that doesn't really get strongly emphasized until graduate school. I think it would be better if people were reading these primary sources more in an undergraduate, if they think they're interested in this as a profession. Reading more widely in those primary sources early on.
Yeah, and what other advice would you give to young Uyghurs who are looking at either academia or in some way or form work related to Uyghurs, or Uyghur studies, or other research paths or careers that are available? What advice would you have for them?
Well, I mean, first let me say that there's a real need for people from the Uyghur community who have expertise on the Uyghur community and have, unfortunately, also there's a need for people with credentials that will get them listened to by people outside of the Uyghur community. So, outside of the question of, how do you get paid for this and how do you get a livelihood from it, there is a sort of a global shortage of Uyghur people who are dedicated to producing that kind of research. Now, part of the reason for that is it's very hard to get paid to do that sometimes. And another reason for that is that the Chinese state for so long has put up barriers to Uyghur people to entering these kinds of fields. So I guess my first the first thing I would want to say to that is that you are needed. We need more Uyghur voices. And if you've read a lot of Uyghur history in English, you probably noticed that Uyghur voices are a very small minority of what's been published in English. And I think that's a that's a problem, and it's a problem that's only going to be solved by getting more Uyghurs into academic programs for history, but not just history, anthropology, political science. For good reason, a lot of the in the recent past, a lot of Uyghur exiles and Uyghur migrants to North America and Europe have focused on professional training like medicine, engineering, because understandably their primary concern is getting an established livelihood, and perhaps even helping people back home with that livelihood. But I think that's led to a bit of an imbalance and toward these professional hard sciences that have left a bit of a gap in the social sciences and humanities. I mean, in terms of the practicalities of pursuing these kinds of careers, I think reaching out to people who already have the job you want and asking them, "How did you get there?" is probably a good technique. I think anybody who's working in the sphere of Uyghur-related issues will be more than happy to have one-on-one conversations with people and give advice.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for saying that. I think it's a very balanced approach to how young Uyghurs can still contribute, even if academia doesn't turn out to be the exact right option for them. I'm also curious then that today I imagine that Uyghur studies are a little different, that in the modern day and age that it's a little more difficult without being able to travel or speak to Uyghurs. And even if you could travel, you wouldn't be able to freely speak with the people there. So how has Uyghur, how have rather Uyghur studies shifted to factor for the lack of access today?
Before I talk about lack of access, I want to talk about a positive way that it has shifted, which is that academic departments, at least in history, but also in related disciplines and area studies, are much more open to hiring specialists on Uyghur topics now than they were 15 years ago. 15 years ago, a lot of people hadn't heard of the Uyghurs. People thought, well, this is an obscure thing. If they were hiring for a historian of China, they would say this is not the real China. If they're hiring for a history of the Islamic world, they say, well, can this person teach Israel-Palestine? So it was a bit of a challenge to get to fit into the slots that people were advertising jobs for. Now there's a lot more sense that, the history of the Uyghurs actually matters to the history of China, or the history of Uyghurs actually matters to the history of the Islamic world. So that's a shift that I think is quite positive. There is more room for scholarship on Uyghurs than there was before. But at the same time, we have this access problem. Most Uyghurs still live in this Chinese administrative region that they call Xinjiang. And many of the events that we're interested in and the cultures of the past that we're interested in played out in that territory. One thing that is changing is a lot of scholars are doing research on diaspora communities. So I would expect 5-10 years from now to see a whole bunch of articles and books in publication about Uyghurs in Turkey, about Uyghurs in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and about Uyghurs in Europe and North America. So that has been a major change. I mean, you can still do research on the Uyghur region proper, most of the manuscript sources are actually not in the Uyghur. They're not actually in under the control of the Chinese government. At least the ones that were already accessible. There are some troves of things that the Chinese state seems to have that weren't accessible anyway before. No one was allowed to see them before. But most of the written sources where I drew from my own like physical encounter with the actual original text, most of them were from St. Petersburg, Russia. Well, that's not as accessible as it used to be. Helsinki, Lund, Sweden. There's good collections in Netherlands, in the UK, in Paris. So a lot of those sources are actually outside. For the Chinese sources, a lot of them are in Taiwan. So there's absolutely still scope to do that work. It is really, for me, I find it difficult to do work and uncomfortable to do work on a place that I haven't been to. But I think it's worth trying, and people are in the process of developing techniques for this. It's also important that a lot of life is lived online today. So, if you're doing more contemporary kinds of research, online is not a separate sphere anymore. It is where a good part of our lives play out. And so I was just doing research today on Chinese manufactured historical sites in the Uyghur region. And
what is that?
Well, like all the things they've added to the Apak Hoja shrine. For example, they have a statue of Ipar Khan, Xiangfei, the fragrant concubine, riding a horse next to Qianlong Emperor, also riding a horse. They're riding horses next to each other. The really interesting one, though, is this place called Xitia Micheng, Xitia Secret City or something, which is a fake ancient city that was built out of nothing around 2012. Where is it? It's somewhere in the south between Kashgar and Yarkand. Anyway, I was able to do a lot of the research that I wanted to do just on video sites, because people are blogging or vlogging this. They're going to the sites and they're making a video tour and giving their impressions of it. I was wondering, like, do the Chinese tourists who go to this Xitia Micheng actually think that this is a historical thing? And I was able to look at a whole bunch of videos where they talk about how authentic it is and, how great it is to be in touch with 1,000-year-old history. So I was able to answer those questions, because people are, having these lives online. So.
That is really interesting, actually. I had never heard of that before, these manufactured historical sites.
Yeah.
But I also want to be mindful of our time. So I wanted to ask you, Ryan, is there anything that you want to talk about or that we should discuss that we just haven't gotten around to yet?
Oh my God, there are thousands, millions of things to discuss, but I think we've covered a lot, and there's nothing that springs to mind.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And if people wanted to contact you, would that be okay? And what would be best? Where would be best?
Yes, especially if people are considering a career in academia. I'm not really qualified to give advice on other careers because I don't know how to do it and I haven't done it, but I do know about the way academia works. And I am committed to making that road as easy as possible for Uyghurs who are interested in it, and also to giving, frank advice about the challenges on that road. So if anybody's interested in that academic path, I would be happy to give them more concrete advice about how that works. I'll probably just share with you some contact information that you can put
Yes.
embed in the site here.
I think that's probably the easiest. And if people wanted to purchase your book, Sacred Routes of History, where would they find that?
Um, Harvard University Press's site. It's on Amazon, and it is most major university libraries have a copy of it. So you can probably just walk into the nearest, whatever the biggest university in your city is, if you live in a city, and look it up and read it in the library as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for coming on to Tarim Talks and speaking with me, for taking the time to do that. And I'm sure that listeners will be walking away better informed, and it was a very engaging conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the fascinating questions.
Thank you for listening to Tarim Talks. I've been your host, Babur Ilchi. If you want to catch other episodes or stay up to date with the Tarim Network, you can go to thetarimnetwork.com, and you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. Stay up to date with us. Our podcast is anywhere you can find podcasts, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. If you want to catch another episode with an academic of Uyghur history, you can see our episode with Dr. Eric Schlussel on YouTube, as it was recorded in person and on video. Thank you very much for listening.